The cops weren't just at my door. They were here because of her, because of Karen. Flashing red and blue lights bounced across the glassy surface of the lake, painting wild stripes over my living room walls. My quiet lakeside home suddenly looked like the set of a crime drama. But I wasn't watching TV. I was standing barefoot on my porch, staring at 2 squad cars in my driveway, neighbors whispering like I'd committed some terrible crime. "Sir, we received a call," one officer began, voice level but firm. "A disturbance was reported at this property." A disturbance. That word sounded almost laughable. I hadn't had so much as a visitor that evening. Yet now, here were the police, flashlights slicing through the dark, scanning my land. I said it out loud before I even realized I never thought refusing to join a Lake HOA would end with me having the cops called on my own property. The officer arched an eyebrow. "You're not a member of the association." That's when it clicked. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. And this absolutely wasn't about a disturbance. This was Karen. Karen. The woman who had strutted down to my porch weeks earlier with her too tight smile. Her manila folder full of mandatory HOA forms. And the belief that my land, my freedom, and my decisions all existed under her rule. And now she had escalated it to the cops. The second officer scanned the paperwork he carried, muttering about violations and shared properties. He asked if they could step inside. Step inside. My home. My chest tightened. Suddenly, I was no longer a man sipping a quiet beer on my porch. I was on trial, under flashing lights, in front of half the neighborhood. Neighbors across the water leaned closer on their docks, whispering, craning their necks. From their angle, it might have looked like I was the one in trouble. And honestly, that's what Karen had wanted all along. Make me look like the problem. Make me look like the outsider. Make everyone believe her version of the story. Here's the real question, though. What would you do in that moment? Smile and let the cops walk through your home just to prove you've done nothing wrong? Or plant your feet in the ground and refuse, knowing you might be painted as uncooperative? That's exactly where I was standing, face to face with police officers, neighbors glaring, and Karen's invisible fingerprints all over the scene. And let me tell you, this wasn't the end of the chaos. It was just the beginning. Because what she didn't know, what not a single person realized at that moment, was that she was arguing with the one person she couldn't afford to cross. Want to know how it all unfolded? Buckle up, you're about to see how this war with Karen spiraled into madness, revenge, and the most satisfying twist of all. But first, before we get there, where are you watching from? Drop your state or country in the comments down below. And if you want more real-life stories where entitled authority gets put in its place, make sure you subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a single episode. Now let's rewind to where this whole nightmare really began. Before the flashing sirens, before the shouting matches, before neighbors were whispering about whether I was the villain on our quiet street, it was just me, the cabin, and the water. That cabin wasn't just a purchase, it was a promise. My family had a history with this lake. As a kid, I'd come here during the summers, fishing off the dock with my grandfather, skipping stones until the sun dipped low, and falling asleep to the hum of cicadas outside the screen windows. Back then, the lake was freedom, the kind of freedom you can't explain if you've only ever lived boxed in by fences and rules. It was the place where my grandfather used to say, "Out here, nobody tells you how to live." So when the chance came to inherit that little slice of shoreline after he passed, I didn't hesitate for a second. Sure, the cabin was old. The paint on the shutters peeled like sunburned skin. The floorboards groaned with history, and the dock leaned just enough to worry anyone but a true fisherman. But to me, it was perfect. Every crack in the wood carried a memory. Every loon's call across the water was like a familiar voice saying, "You're home." I thought owning this cabin would mean peace, solitude, and reconnecting with everything my grandfather taught me. What I didn't realize was that I hadn't just inherited his little piece of paradise. I'd stepped into the territory of someone else's kingdom, and her name was Karen. The first time I saw her, she was marching down the street, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like they were armor. She didn't stroll. She didn't wave. She surveyed, like she was inspecting a kingdom that belonged to her. She stopped in front of my cabin one morning, tapped a pen on her clipboard, and scribbled something down before I even had the chance to ask what she was doing. At first, I laughed it off. Everyone has a quirky neighbor, right? The one who's a little too invested in other people's lawns or vacation schedules. But it became clear, very quickly, that Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was self-proclaimed royalty of the so-called Lake HOA. The thing was, my cabin wasn't part of her HOA. It couldn't be. The deed said it plain and simple. My grandfather had bought the land long before Karen's committee ever organized. And yet, despite that simple, stubborn fact, she acted like my refusal to bow to her rules was some personal attack. I still remember that first real conversation with her. I was repainting the shutters, forest green, the same color my grandfather had used decades before. She swept into the yard, clipboard clutched against her chest, and said, "We have a rule about lake-facing paint colors." I looked at her, brush in hand, probably still dripping paint, and asked, "We?" "The association," she replied, like it should have been obvious. Then, with just the faintest smirk, "You'll need to sign up soon anyway." I told her the truth. "My property isn't under your HOA." That smirk vanished quicker than a summer storm. Her lips tightened, her voice dropped. "Everyone joins eventually." It was such a small sentence, but it chilled me. Like she wasn't asking, it was a warning. And from that day on, I noticed things differently. The neighbors who barely spoke to me but nodded to her. The way she left little reminders in people's mailboxes. Fines taped to doors. The whispered grumbling at community bonfires that stopped whenever she approached. It became clear. This wasn't a friendly group of neighbors pooling money for fireworks on the 4th of July. This was Karen's kingdom. And I am, the grandson who just wanted to repaint shutters and fish off the dock, was suddenly a threat to her authority. The lake I thought I'd inherited for peace and freedom began to feel like something else entirely. Like I'd stepped into a chessboard where Karen thought she controlled every piece. Her allies, her rules, her fake authority. But here's the thing about people like her. They can't stand when someone refuses to play along. And I refused. Little did I know that refusal was about to drag me into a fight much bigger than peeling shutters or fishing rights. Because when people like Karen feel their power slipping, they don't go quietly. They go nuclear. And her first move in this war? Oh, that was just around the corner. It was a Saturday morning, one of those perfect early summer days where the lake looked like polished glass and the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. I'd set my coffee mug on the porch railing and was debating whether to spend the day fishing or finally fixing that loose dock board when I saw her coming, Karen, marching down the lane with that purposeful stride, sunglasses locked on like a visor and a manila folder tucked under her arm like a briefcase of state secrets. The clipboard wasn't enough, apparently. This time, she came armed. "Good morning," she called out with that polished brightness that always carried the faintest edge of steel. Before I could answer, she was already moving up the path to hand me the packet as though the transaction were a done deal. "This is your new resident's welcome packet," she said, pushing the thick stack of papers into my palm. "By joining the association, you'll have access to our lake amenities, community barbecue events, and of course, we'll just need your first payment of dues for maintenance. $150 will cover this quarter." It was practiced, too practiced, like she'd rehearsed that speech for anyone unlucky enough to move near her domain. I thumbed through the stack absent-mindedly. Pages upon pages of rules, from dock decoration guidelines to parking restrictions to quiet hours that looked suspiciously like Karen's bedtime. I finally set the packet on the porch railing next to my coffee and said calmly, "This isn't for me. My property isn't part of your HOA." She blinked once, twice, like a glitch in the matrix. Her smile didn't falter, but something behind it did. "I'm afraid that's not possible," she replied, voice still sugary, but the pitch rising slightly. "Every home with lake access is under the association. It's the only way to keep the community standards high." And here's where I pause the story, just for a second, because this is something a lot of people don't realize. In reality, an HOA can't just rope you in because they want to. You're either bound by the covenants and restrictions tied to your deed, or you're not. Period. If the legal language isn't there, they've got no authority over you. They can pressure, they can bluff, they can sneak in intimidation, but legally, they're just smoke and mirrors. And Karen? Oh, she was blowing a lot of smoke that morning. "Actually," I told her plainly, "my deed doesn't include any HOA obligations. This cabin predates the association and my property is independent. You can double-check in the records, but legally, I don't owe dues, I'm not under your rules, and I don't have to join." That's when the mask slipped. The polite cheer hardened into something sharper. Her smile froze so tightly it could have cracked porcelain. She stepped just a little closer. "Everyone joins," she said, each word clipped, deliberate, eventually. It wasn't an invitation. It was a threat dressed up in polite packaging. I could practically hear the unsaid, "You'll regret crossing me," and in that moment realized this wasn't about community standards or lake maintenance. This was about power. Karen wasn't defending a neighborhood. She was building a kingdom brick by brick, and I had just refused to kneel. What I didn't know yet was how far she'd go to make me bend, because the notes, the gossip, the so-called violations, those were only the warm-up. Her next play would take the word harassment to a whole new level. "If you think Karen took my polite no and went back to watering her begonias, you don't know Karen. That single refusal lit a fire in her, and before long, I was at the center of a storm no one had prepared me for. It started with the notes. They showed up like clockwork, slipped under my door, taped neatly to my gate, or tucked under the wipers of my truck. Some of them looked official in tone, written on letterheads stamped Lake Association. Others were hand-scribbled, just sharp scrawls dripping with condescension. "You have mowed your lawn twice this week. Excessive mowing disturbs lake tranquility. Residents must use approved fertilizer brands to avoid water contamination. You have not registered your lawn care routine with the HOA." But the one that nearly made me laugh coffee through my nose. "Your shutters are painted in an unapproved shade of green. Acceptable shades are Hunter Forest or Lake Moss only." I know what you're thinking. Did she seriously try to regulate the color green? Yes. Yes, she did. Now, I could have shrugged it off as ridiculous. But here's the thing. Karen wasn't just tossing harmless paper darts at my doorstep. She wanted to build an image. Every note was like ammunition for gossip, whispers sent around to seed doubt in the community. He's not following the rules. He's disrespecting the lake. He thinks he's above us. And let me tell you, neighbors started looking at me differently. I'd wave from my porch, and instead of smiles, I got tight nods. Conversations down by the dock went quiet as soon as I walked up. She was winning her little campaign because perception is often more powerful than truth. Then came the violations. That's when I knew she was escalating. One morning I found a bright orange slip tucked under my windshield wiper, bold letters across the top. Parking violation, subject to fine. Fine for what? Exactamente. Lee? I was parked in my own driveway. When I called the number listed at the bottom, I realized it forwarded straight to the Lake HOA office. You'll never guess who answered. "Association office, this is Karen," she said, without a hint of irony. I nearly choked. She had created a fake office line to funnel her intimidation tactics. When I asked under what authority she thought she could ticket my car, the silence on the other end spoke volumes. Then came the inevitable line. "Everyone joins eventually." her mantra, her obsession. By now, I wasn't even angry as much as fascinated. Fascinated in the same way you can't look away from a train wreck. Because I knew deep down that all these paper threats meant Karen felt her grip tightening around me, trying desperately to reel me into her web. And the more I resisted, the more frantic her moves became. Here's the part that frustrates me most. Some neighbors actually believed her. One man approached me at the marina and said, "Look, if she's fining you, you must have done something wrong. Why not just join and go along? It's easier for everyone." That right there, that's how Karens thrive. Not through actual authority, but through manufactured compliance. They count on people being too tired, too busy, or too afraid to fight back. And I'll admit, for a fleeting second, I thought, maybe it would be easier to just sign the paper, pay the dues, and shut her up. But every time I considered it, I remembered my grandfather's words on that porch years ago. Out here, nobody tells you how to live, and I wasn't about to let Karen erase that legacy. So, I stopped laughing at the notes. I started saving them. Every fake violation, every threat-filled letter, every voicemail message when she called late at night. I began stacking them neatly in a folder, my own arsenal. Because if there's one thing worse than a bully, it's a bully who doesn't realize you're keeping receipts. But Karen, of course, didn't know I was preparing. To her, I was just another stubborn obstacle standing in her way. And with each failed intimidation, she was getting bolder, nastier, and far more dangerous. What I didn't realize then was that petty notes and gossip were just the opening act. Her next move would bring the entire neighborhood into the crossfire and test whether I was ready to fight her head on. Because the day Karen turned the community against me, that was when things truly spiraled out of control. For weeks, I felt like I was fighting this war on my own. Notes piling up, whispers around the marina, orange violations sticking to my windshield like neon threats. And honestly, that's what Karen wanted. Me isolated, cornered, with no one to back me up. But here's the thing about dictators, large or small, eventually the cracks start to show. It started one evening as I was taking the trash down to the bins by the road. My neighbor, Jim, was out front fiddling with his fishing gear. He was older, wiry, with a sun-leathered face that said he'd spent more hours on the water than indoors. For weeks he'd barely given me more than a nod. But that night, he called out quietly, almost conspiratorially. "Hey," he said, "you're the one standing up to Karen, right?" I paused, wary, wondering if this was a trap. But something in his tone was different, less accusatory, more intrigued. When I confirmed it, Jim shook his head and chuckled darkly. "Good for you. About time someone did." That's when his story came pouring out. Karen had once fined him for leaving his grandkids' bikes leaned against the side of his garage overnight. Not blocking the road, not rusting away, just leaning for a single night. When he pushed back, she threatened to restrict his guest access to lake privileges. Never mind that his deed mentioned nothing about her rights over his property. That was the first crack in her crown I saw up close. And soon, more followed. A few days later, I ran into Tracy at the dock. She was a young mom who lived 2 houses down, always waving cheerfully as she wrangled her kids near the water. She leaned in toward me with that same hushed tone Jim had used and whispered, "Karen fined us last summer for our barbecue. Said the smoke was a community nuisance. Can you believe that?" Then she smirked. We grilled twice as much the next weekend. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. The picture was becoming clear. Everyone had a Karen story. They just hadn't realized how many others shared the same battle scars. And here's where I want to share a little knowledge nugget with you, because this is exactly how overbearing HOAs get away with it. They operate on intimidation, not legality. Unless the association is written into your deed or you voluntarily sign into it, they can scream violations all they want. The only law they're enforcing is fear. And trust me, The second people realize they actually have rights outside those bylaws, the whole facade crumbles. So I asked Jim and Tracy the obvious question. Has she ever actually taken anyone to court? They looked at each other and laughed. Jim finally said, "Nah, Karen doesn't go to court. She just pushes hard enough until people give up. Makes her look powerful, but it's all bluff." That was it. The confirmation I needed. I hadn't just inherited a cabin. I'd inherited a neighborhood under the thumb of someone who ruled through smoke, mirrors, and intimidation. And now people, everyday folks like Jim and Tracy, were quietly yearning for someone to push back. We started talking more often, standing in driveways, chatting at the dock, comparing notes, sharing every petty violation and threat Karen had thrown at us. Piece by piece, the picture of her fake empire came into focus. Drop in the comments if your HOA ever tried pulling stunts like this. I'd say if you were sitting right there with us. Because listening to Jim, Tracy, and eventually half a dozen others, it felt like a rite of passage everybody in an HOA horror story seems to share. Intimidation, silence, compliance, or resistance. And something else happened that I hadn't felt since those quiet childhood summers. Community. Real community. Not the kind Karen built with paper threats and glares across the dock. This was built with laughter, shared frustrations, and the relief of realizing we weren't crazy and we weren't alone. But Karen, of course, didn't know about these driveway meetings and whispered dockside conspiracies. She still thought she was playing chess with pawns that would eventually bow to her queen. She had no idea the pawns were starting to talk, starting to align. And when pawns unite, the queen has a serious problem. The problem for us, though, was that Karen had one more move in her pocket, and it didn't involve notes or gossip this time. It involved bringing the law to my doorstep. Just when it felt like momentum was finally shifting, that neighbors were quietly standing up, that Karen's grip was starting to slacken, she made her boldest, most dangerous move. It was a Friday evening, one of those golden hours where the lake glowed like molten copper and kids' laughter drifted across the water. I just sat on the porch with a beer in hand when the low hum of an engine crept into my driveway. At first, I figured it was a delivery truck, nothing unusual. But then came the second engine, and the flashing lights, 2 police cruisers. The sound of their radios cut through the summer air, followed by the slam of car doors. Across the road, curtains twitched. Neighbors poked out their heads like prairie dogs, watching as red and blue danced across my cabin's front wall. My stomach sank. I already knew who was responsible. They didn't waste time. 2 officers, stern, businesslike, made their way up my path. Their flashlights clicked on even though the sun still hung just above the tree line as if to spotlight their presence. "Sir," one began, adjusting his belt as he stood squarely on my steps. "We received a call from the Lake Association regarding a disturbance and trespassing issue." "Excuse me?" I cut him off, eyebrows practically leaping off my forehead. "A disturbance? Trespassing? On my own land?" The other officer raised a hand calmly. "We were told by the HOA president that portions of this property fall under community ownership. She claims you're not authorized to use certain areas." There it was. Her power play. Karen had tipped her queen over and replaced it with a siren. Behind them, standing smugly at the edge of my property line, there she was. Arms crossed, lips tight in that signature faux smile, watching everything unfold. She wasn't hiding. She wanted me to see her orchestrating this circus. For a moment, rage flared hotter than the summer air around us. My grandfather's cabin. Our dock built with his own hands. And she had the gall to tell the police I was trespassing here? I steadied my breathing. This wasn't the time to shout because the truth is, situations like this can go south fast. When cops show up, their job is to sort stories. And whoever looks calmer tends to be believed. And I had every reason to remain calm. Truth was on my side. "Officers," I said evenly, I think you've been misinformed. My deed is clean. This cabin predates the association. Everything you see here, house, dock, land, is privately owned. I have the paperwork inside if you'd like to review it." They exchanged a look. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes. Karen must have noticed too, because she swooped forward like a hawk to inject herself into the conversation. "Don't let him fool you," she snapped. "Everyone here knows the rules. He's ignoring fines, ignoring procedures. He thinks he's above the community." Her voice cut through the air, shrill and desperate, laced with just enough venom to make a neighbor across the street whisper something to their spouse. She pointed at me like she was unmasking a villain. One officer turned back to me. "Do you deny receiving notices?" "Notices?" I gestured toward my house. "I've got an entire folder of phony notes she's left me. Stuff about how often I mow, what color I paint my shutters, none of them remotely legal, and not a single one tied to my deed." For a long second, silence pulsed between us. Behind the officers, Karen's expression slipped, just for a flicker. Her eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. She hadn't expected me to stand this firm. "I'll be happy to show documentation," I added, taking a careful step toward my porch. "You'll see plain as day. No covenants, no restrictions, no HOA authority on this property." The taller officer sighed. "All right, let's take a look at what you've got." And in that exact moment, watching Karen's face as the narrative shifted, I knew the tide was turning. Because if there's one thing bullies can't stand, it's paperwork. The officers followed me toward the door, skeptical but professional. Karen lingered at the edge of the yard, clearly itching to protest, but she couldn't stop them. My hands shook only slightly as I reached for the manila envelope I'd begun compiling. The very folder of notes, deeds, and all the evidence of her harassment. I laid it out on the table for the officers as methodically as I could, heartbeat pounding as I realized just how close she'd come to making me look like a criminal. But here's the part she never saw coming. There was something more powerful than deeds, more cutting than all her gossip, and more dangerous than her clipboard. Because Karen wasn't just my neighbor. She was also my tenant. And the moment I reminded myself of that fact, I realized I wasn't the one cornered here. She was. The officers flipped through the paperwork I laid on the dining room table, carefully inspecting the deed and the highlighted lines I'd marked out weeks earlier, just in case this day ever came. All the while, Karen stood outside near the window, arms folded so tight it looked like she was holding herself together by sheer willpower. One officer finally looked up at me. "You're right. The documents show no covenants attached to this property. If that's accurate, then the association has no jurisdiction here." I nodded calmly, though inside my pulse hammered like a drum solo. It wasn't just about validating my independence. It was about watching, out of the corner of my eye, the way Karen's face twitched toward panic as she overheard. But here's the thing. I wasn't done, because tucked just behind that deed in my manila folder was another document, one that had nothing to do with HOA bylaws, but everything to do with shutting Karen down once and for all. The officers began packing up the paperwork, ready to chalk this up as a neighborhood misunderstanding. That's when I leaned slightly forward and said evenly, "There's one more thing you should know." Both officers paused. Karen shuffled closer to the porch, curiosity radiating from the other side of the glass. I slid out the lease agreement, crisp, signed, binding. "This," I said, tapping the signature line for emphasis, "is the rental contract for 14 White Oaks Road. That's Karen's address, which means—" I paused, savoring it. "I'm her landlord." The silence that followed felt like the lake itself had frozen. The taller officer's eyebrows shot up. The second officer let out a sound that was almost a laugh before catching himself. And outside, Karen's face drained of color like I'd pulled the plug on her entire operating system. "Wait," one officer finally asked. You're telling us the complainant rents from you? That's correct, I said. She rents the property, under my ownership. I lifted the document so both could read clearly. So when she's harassing me with fabricated claims, when she's calling the police to paint me as a trespasser on my own land, she's doing it while living under my roof, both figuratively and legally. I let it hang in the air for a beat and then, because this was too good not to repeat, I leaned in and added, yes, you heard me right. HOA President Karen rents from me. I'm her landlord. Can you imagine that? One officer exhaled slowly through his nose, shaking his head. The other chewed the inside of his cheek, clearly reevaluating every word Karen had said on the call. And outside, Karen had gone from smug to sputtering, her lips moving soundlessly as though rewiring the script she'd been working from all along. If you've ever seen a schoolyard bully get caught lying with the teacher watching, you know that beautiful moment when their entire performance collapses? That's what I saw on that porch. Her shoulders, once stiff with superiority, sagged, her fists unclenched. Her sunglasses slipped just an inch down her nose. For the first time, Karen looked small. You realize reporting false claims to law enforcement can carry consequences, one officer told her sternly as he stepped back outside. Especially when directed at your landlord. Karen stammered, I was just trying to protect the community. Her voice wobbled, stripped of its manufactured authority. But no one was buying it anymore. Not the cops, not the neighbors peeking through their curtains, not me. Here's where the irony really set in. All this time she had been parading around the lake like a queen, demanding dues and obedience, tossing threats like confetti. Yet the entire time she'd built her castle on land that didn't even belong to her. Talk about poetic justice. Inside, I kept my posture calm. But a part of me wanted to laugh, not because of cruelty, but because finally, the tides had turned. For weeks, I'd been the villain, the non-compliant neighbor, the one with orange violations stuck to his car, the one whispered about behind folded arms. But in that one moment, the curtain pulled back, and everyone saw the truth. The emperor had no clothes, or rather, the queen bee was standing on borrowed ground. The officers nodded politely, assured me this wasn't a criminal matter, and advised Karen, in not-so-friendly tones, to stop tying up emergency resources with bogus calls. Karen's face looked like thunder, but her voice had gone soft, almost inaudible. I was just trying to maintain standards. Yeah, I said, half under my breath but loud enough for her, and maybe a few porch-watching neighbors, to hear. Standards don't mean much when you don't own the house you live in. And I promise you, in that instant, something cracked inside her. The first true crack in the icy mask she wore around everyone. Even bullies don't know what to do when they find themselves in checkmate. But don't think for a second that was the end of it. Because Karen wasn't about to slink into the shadows after being embarrassed. No, what came next was her fight to claw back whatever dignity she thought she had left. And it was uglier, louder, and more public than anything she had pulled before. Karen didn't retreat quietly. Not her style. If anything, the landlord revelation sent her into a tailspin of desperation. Standing there, her face tightened like a rubber band stretched too far, she tried to summon the old authority she'd wielded for years. This isn't over, she snapped, turning to the officers with an imperious glare. The HOA has bylaws. He can't just ignore them. We'll take legal action. We have lawyers. We'll sue. Her words came out in sharp bursts, but they clattered to the ground with no weight. If this had been 2 weeks earlier, maybe people would have still believed her. Maybe the neighbors huddled behind curtains would have nodded and whispered about her being the defender of order. But in that moment, with the police stepping back, her voice sounded less like a queen giving orders and more like a child stamping her foot at the dinner table. The taller officer, clearly tired of babysitting a neighborhood spat, cut her off. "Ma'am, I need you to hear me clearly. This man's property isn't subject to your association. You have no authority to issue fines, tickets, or rules concerning it. Making false police reports can have consequences. Am I clear?" "Consequences?" Karen sputtered, eyes darting around like she was searching for backup. "I was acting in the best interest of the entire community." "No," I said quietly from the porch, my voice steady but firm. "You were acting in your own interest. There's a difference." The neighbors across the way heard it. I saw them exchange stiff smiles, barely suppressing laughter. That's when I realized the tide had fully turned. Karen tried one more tactic. She wheeled on me, jabbing a finger like a prosecutor in a courtroom drama. "You think just because you're my landlord you get to silence me? That you can undermine the association? I have every right to—" "Karen," I interrupted, calm but cutting. "You don't even have the right to keep putting your trash can on the curb without following your lease terms. Let's not pretend you run this lake." The sound that followed wasn't laughter per se, but it was close. Neighbors on porches chuckled. Even Jim, 2 doors down, appeared on his front step, shaking his head with barely disguised amusement. And that was when the house of cards collapsed. Because the one thing bullies can't stand even more than opposition is humiliation. And humiliation in front of an audience? That's the final nail in their coffin. Seeing the crowd gathering, Tracy, the mom with the barbecue story, shouted from her yard, "Hey Karen, you going to find me again this summer for grilling hot dogs?" Her kids giggled behind her. Someone else chimed in, louder, "Or should we register our bicycles before leaning them on the garage, Your Highness?" The wave spread, voices poking holes in her paper crown until it all shredded to pieces. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control of the whispers. She was the subject of them. The officers, clearly realizing the situation had shifted beyond their need, gave me a nod. "You're well within your rights, sir. If you need further assistance dealing with harassment, file a formal complaint." Translation: "We believe you, not her." When they finally pulled out of the driveway, the lights fading into the dark, it hit me. Karen had just been publicly defanged. Her face, though, burn it into memory. Pale, furious, trembling from humiliation. She muttered something about legal proceedings, but it had no bite anymore. Neighbors weren't nodding along with her. They were grinning, emboldened, finally free of her shadow. And that's when the remarkable thing happened. Jim walked up, clapped me on the shoulder, and said loudly enough for the onlookers to hear, "Been needing someone to stand up to her for years. Guess it took he landlord to do it." Cheers, actual cheers, followed from around the yards. Tracy raised her soda can like a toast. Another neighbor muttered, "About time." For the first time since this battle began, I felt what community was supposed to feel like. Genuine, supportive, united, not weaponized into submission by one woman's obsession with power. Karen, she spun on her heel and stormed off, her forced authority shriveling behind her with every step. And as her front door slammed, the echo wasn't power, it was defeat. Still though, in the back of my mind, a thought lingered. People like Karen don't just vanish, don't just surrender after years of control. She might be cornered, but she wasn't done. And if you think the satisfaction of that night was the end of the story, think again. Because what happened in the days after made it clear. Her downfall wasn't just about me. It was about an entire neighborhood finally reclaiming its lake. The following week, the lake felt different. The air was lighter, the water calmer, the whole neighborhood quieter. Not in that tense, suffocating way it had been under Karen's watchful eye, but in a way that finally felt free. For the first time in months, I could sit on my porch without glancing over my shoulder, waiting for another note to show up taped to my door, or to hear Karen's shoes clicking up my driveway. And it wasn't just me who felt the shift. Neighbors who had once ducked their heads when I waved now stopped to chat. Some apologized outright. "We should have told you sooner," Jim confessed, shaking his head. "All of us had our run-ins with her. We just thought no one else wanted to fight." The truth was out in the open now. Karen hadn't been an HOA president. She'd been a paper tyrant. Her power had never come from actual authority, only from intimidation and people's reluctance to push back. That illusion shattered the moment the cops looked at my deed and the lease that put her directly under my thumb. It didn't take long for the fallout to arrive. At a hastily called association meeting, one that I caught bits of "I'm Jim and Tracy" afterwards, the board quietly distanced themselves from Karen. Apparently, even she couldn't bluff her way through explaining why she'd weaponized the police against her own landlord, wasting their time with fabricated claims. Within days, she resigned her presidency. If she hadn't, they were ready to vote her out. Turns out, paper queens don't last long when the crowd stops applauding. And just to add salt to her wound, her lease with me came up for renewal shortly after. Given the choice between housing someone who spent months trying to humiliate me or regaining my peace of mind, it wasn't difficult. Paperwork was signed. Karen had to move. The day she packed her minivan and left, the lake was quiet except for the sound of neighbors exhaling in relief. There were no tears shed, no waves goodbye. The door that had once slammed behind her with self-righteous authority closed for the last time, and stayed closed. Weeks later, as summer stretched toward fall, something remarkable happened. We started having small gatherings again. Not association-mandated barbecues or meetings with sign-in sheets, but actual neighborly evenings by the fire pit, kids riding their bikes wherever they wanted, dock parties with someone bringing a cooler of soda and another setting up a grill. The lake didn't just feel like mine again. It felt like ours. A community based not on fines and fear, but on laughter, cooperation, and mutual respect. One evening, as the sun sank over the water and the crickets began their nightly chorus, I sat on the edge of my dock with a beer in hand. For the first time since inheriting this cabin, I truly felt like I'd honored my grandfather's words. Out here, nobody tells you how to live. No more harassment, no more clipboard threats, no HOA dues that were never owed in the first place. Just freedom, peace, and neighbors who were finally free to be neighbors again. The lake belonged to us now, and this time nobody, certainly not Karen, was writing the rules. Here's the truth. People like Karen aren't rare. They're everywhere. They thrive in HOAs, office politics, neighborhood committees, anywhere they can grab a clipboard and convince people they hold power. And too often, we let them. Why? Because we're scared, tired, or we believe it's easier to play along. But if this story proved anything, it's that bullies don't win when they're confronted with truth, community, and a little bit of fearless backbone. Karen didn't lose because I yelled louder. She lost because the law was on my side, my neighbors stood with me, and her paper empire couldn't withstand the light of reality. So what's the takeaway? Know your rights, whether it's a deed, a lease, or your basic autonomy. Protect it, understand it, and never let anyone steamroll you with fake authority. Remember, intimidation is not law, fear is not obligation, and silence only fuels tyrants. But at the same time, don't forget the other part of this story. I didn't win by standing alone on a lonely porch. I won because other people, neighbors who were just as sick of the harassment, shared their stories, their support, and stood with me. Community isn't built through control. It's built through solidarity. That's true by the lake, and it's true wherever you live. And here's where I bring you in, because I know so many of you have lived versions of this story. If you've ever dealt with an out-of-control HOA, a nightmare landlord, or a Karen who thought rules were crowns, share your story in the comments below. Not just because I want to read them, though I definitely do, but because every comment builds a community of people who've learned they don't have to bow to petty tyrants. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around. Because if you thought this saga with Karen was wild, wait until you hear what happened in the next HOA nightmare I lived through, compared to what HOA next. This almost feels tame. Spoiler, it involves fines so outrageous you'll swear I made them up. But nope, it's all real. So before you click away, make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell icon so you won't miss it when that story drops. You don't want to be the one who hears about it secondhand. I promise. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about me versus Karen. It's about all of us standing together against the paper tyrants of the world. And when we do, the lakes, the neighborhoods, and the communities finally belong to us.